Welcome to the faculty seminar. Hey, troops, shut up. Welcome to the student faculty seminar of the President's Lecture Series and the Philosophy Forum. It's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce Professor Robert English. He is professor and director at the School of International Relations at the University of Southern California. And if you hope to be well-versed in international affairs, you cannot be better prepared and more skilled than Professor English. He was an official in the Department of Defense. He was a senior researcher at a think tank. He's a scholar, a teacher, and the author of 3 books on international relations. We will be the beneficiary of his expertise this evening at 8 o'clock in the Denison Theater when Professor English will present the Cappadocia lecture. The title will be Ukraine, Russia, and the West, Crisis, Causes, and Consequences. Yay for alliteration. And his topic this afternoon is Reconsidering the Cold War's End. Please join me in welcoming Professor English.
Okay, just checking that this works. The title here really encompasses my overarching conclusion, which is, in other words, that by misunderstanding the process by which the Cold War ended in the late 1980s, we in the West, and especially the United States, adopted policies that made today's confrontation with post-Soviet Russia much more likely. Yes, I am talking, of course, about the policy of NATO's continual expansion to the east, but not only that. I'm also talking about economic and social policies born of an ill-founded self-assurance that have greatly complicated transitions in other post-communist states. And I'm also speaking about a hubris or a triumphalism that have led to foreign policy failures in the Middle East, Southwest, and East Asia as well. Time permitting, I'll detail some of these at the end. The main part of my talk, however, is necessarily given instead to describing how the Cold War actually ended, and to analyzing how and why so much of our academic profession and our foreign policy establishment got it wrong. In a nutshell, they got it, or they get it wrong, by viewing the Cold War's end, oops, that's premature, by viewing the Cold War's end as an unambiguous triumph of American power. Policies of containment, of pressure, that bankrupted the Soviet rival into an unavoidable retreat. There certainly was a power or material aspect to the Soviet policies of reform at home and retreat from empire abroad. But to neglect the roles of ideas and leadership is to miss at least half of the story. Clearly, I haven't got my notes coordinated with the slides. That'll just make it more exciting for you. To convince you of this, that power is only half of the story, and maybe even the less important half, I have to take you back to the late Cold War, to the early and mid-1980s, when virtually all of the academic profession agreed the USSR was under economic and social strain, but radical reforms were decidedly not in the offing. Let's catch up with the pictures. Don't want to rush through the pretty ones. Here we are. As I said, the consensus of the profession was that no major reforms were in the offing, notwithstanding the heightened confrontation and pressure on the Soviet Union. And here I should note the agreement, the unity of two different branches of that academic profession. Area studies experts, or so-called Sovietologists, that's what I was trained to be, and international relations theorists, political scientists of a very different stripe. But with this unity on the core questions outlined here, naturally, of course, the foreign policy establishment, the talking heads, the Washington, the Pentagon advisors, were in agreement as well. More Cold War for the indefinite future. Sort of like snow around here. So when a new Soviet leader came to power in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev, there was near unanimity that this meant basically status quo in Soviet policies. Yet significant changes began almost immediately, and sweeping ones. Once unthinkable reforms weren't far behind. Even before announcing his perestroika, even before we heard this word, restructuring, Gorbachev broke the ice in US-Soviet relations with a series of bold disarmament proposals, radical cuts in strategic weapons, a comprehensive nuclear test ban, major reductions in conventional forces as well, and verification measures that would increase openness and confidence. These proposals, which were, by the way, broadly dismissed at the time as phony or insincere or unworkable, in fact led eventually to precisely the sorts of US-Soviet agreements that were signed a few years later. And they were accompanied by a gradual but soon definitive repudiation of ideology in foreign policy. Essentially a dumping of Marxist-Leninist ideology, the anti-capitalist, the world is divided into rival classes approach to foreign affairs. An approach, an ideology that had dominated Soviet thinking for 70 full years. Instead, the new thinking, новое мышление, of Gorbachev and his liberal allies declared that his country and all countries in the world must base their foreign relations on what he called universal human values, or universal liberal values, общечеловеческие ценности. As heady as this was, however, and we're still in the mid-1980s, 1986, 1987, maybe 1988, even more exciting was what burst forth on the Soviet domestic scene. When Communist Party conservatives essentially blocked Gorbachev's early economic reforms, which in any case we now know were too timid to work, Gorbachev added glasnost, or openness, to perestroika. He did it to put pressure on those conservatives in the party and to shake up society for the necessary scale of changes that lay ahead. This meant progressively removing the shackles from the media, cinema, literature, and culture, and eventually virtually any form of public information and debate. Once forbidden books were published. Once banned films were screened. Journals and newspapers began tearing the cover off the misdeeds and lies of the past. And TV became a bold new medium for debate of all issues, from the mistakes of Lenin or the crimes of Stalin, all the way up to the foreign policy blunders of the recent past, the invasion of Czechoslovakia, even the invasion of Afghanistan, where an occupation was still underway. Foreign books and newspapers now became broadly available. Even foreign television, at least in major metropolitan centers, began to be broadcast alongside now enlivened Soviet Russian programming. Foreign travel, openness across the board. So if perestroika with glasnost, and foreign policy new thinking, which we've already seen, were two pillars of Gorbachev's reforms. Then the third was democratization, demokratizacja. You probably remember, even the younger among you, if you've studied or read a bit, that in the spring of 1989, multi-candidate elections were held in the Soviet Union for a new national parliament, the Congress of People's Deputies, a new body that would have significant say over policy debates, significant power over executive appointments and budgets, and in other respects operate as a true democratic legislature. You may remember this, but did you know that it wasn't something that sprang up in 1989 under some kind of popular pressure or duress, but rather was something that Gorbachev had been planning for 2 or 3 years prior, back when the only pressure to do so came from his own liberal, reformist, dare I say, democratic inclinations. Also in 1985, Gorbachev had been discussing with his inner circle of advisors steps to inject real democracy, as they said, into this Communist Party-dominated system. In 1986 and 1987, he legalized independent political clubs and organizations. And in 1988, he permitted their essential transformation into rival political parties, rivals to the only party existing at that time, of course, which was the Communist Party. And also, already in 1987, I emphasize how early, just a year and a half into his rule, he put before a Central Committee plenum, right, the main governing body outside the weekly Politburo meetings, a plan for largely free multi-candidate elections, first to local, then regional, and finally to this new national legislature. I'm emphasizing how early, right from the beginning, this was part of Gorbachev's plan. Still, all the way through 1988-89, despite all the foreign and domestic changes I've described, many foreign observers and specialist analysts remain skeptical. Even though the Cold War arguably was already ending, by now with sweeping nuclear and conventional arms agreements, with a turn away from proxy wars and rivalry, instead to peacemaking and reconciliation in various Central American, African, and Asian hotspots. With the now underway and soon to be completed withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan. And above all, with the clear message Gorbachev delivered, first privately and then publicly, that conservative Communist Party leaders in Eastern Europe, in the heart of the Soviet security bloc, must reform too, because there would be no more invasions to prop them up when their own people rebelled. We call this the end of the Brezhnev Doctrine, I suppose, if you know. That was the doctrine that justified Soviet intervention in other communist countries to keep the communist system in power. Already in 1986, in private Warsaw Pact councils, Gorbachev had announced that this era was over. You will sink or swim on your own, therefore you'd better reform and make your systems more efficient and more humane. And I suppose we remember what happened in Eastern Europe mainly because it led so swiftly in 88 and especially 89, very much on the Soviet model that Gorbachev had pioneered, to new democratic elections, which replaced communist parties one after another. And this miraculous year, this annus mirabilis of 1989, ends, of course, with the scene you see here. The Berlin Wall comes down, or is actually breached, and the Cold War, it seems, is finally over. I'm arguing, if you're paying attention along the way, that maybe it ended even earlier. Now, I'm not in the majority on this. Absolute majority of international relations specialists would, in fact, put the date much later. Only in 1991, when the Soviet Union itself collapsed, was the Cold War really over. Or maybe in 1990, when Gorbachev permitted Germany to reunify. Or again, as I said, maybe 89. Many believe that the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe was most important. This guy here, I would argue that rather it's 88 and even 87. Because by this time, with the examples I've given you, Gorbachev had decided on the principal policies that simply now needed another year or two to bear fruit. He had changed Soviet positions on nuclear and conventional arms talks. He had decided to withdraw from Afghanistan. He had decided to remove Soviet troops from Cam Ranh Bay in Vietnam, or to end support for Fidel Castro in Cuba, and a legion of other examples. And it simply took another year or two to implement these policies. But if the key decisions had been made by the key decision maker, then a strong case can be made, in fact, that that was the real end of the Cold War. So where did this come from? I'm obviously putting a lot of emphasis on this leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. What were the origins of his so-called new thinking, his foreign policy reforms? If it wasn't only about Star Wars, the new Strategic Defense Initiative, scaring the Soviets, threatening to bankrupt them into a new round of the arms race, coupled with the pressure of Stinger missiles supplied to the Afghan rebels. And then, as you saw in my early slide, solidarity, support for the free trade union movement in communist Poland. If these sorts of external pressure were not the real, or at least the main cause for Gorbachev's domestic and foreign policy reforms, then what were the real causes? Let's go through fairly quickly a biography to help us understand this history-making leader. Gorbachev, I think these slides pretty much tell the story, is a farm boy. He was born in Stavropol in southern Russia, right near the Caucasus Mountains. His relatives on both sides of the family had suffered repressions under Stalin, meaning had been jailed, accused of being traitors on trumped-up charges, and sent away to prison or the Gulag. He was bright, ambitious, and he won a scholarship to the Harvard, Stanford, USC, Yale, and Montana combined, which was Moscow State University, a university that stands so far above others in the Soviet Union that I have to describe it collectively that way. Only by winning a gold medal, being the valedictorian of his high school class, could a farm boy like him get into this elite and very selective, also very, how shall we say, tilting towards the children of the elite institution. He was smart enough to do that. And he came to Moscow to study in the mid-1950s. In fact, just before Stalin's death, but then through the whole period of Stalin's death and the early campaigns that followed of de-Stalinization. You know that Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev, denounced Stalin as a tyrant, began tearing the veil off Stalin's crimes and blunders, from the terror and phony purge trials at home to the mismanagement of alliances and the Second World War abroad. And that launched the so-called thaw epoch, when not just criticism of Stalin, but new literary topics, new openness on social issues, a welcoming of foreign film festivals and youth gatherings, and the first academic exchanges with Western countries, not just sports heroes or ballerinas in the Bolshoi orchestra, but now academics, historians, political scientists were coming and going. And in many respects, at least in its major urban centers like Moscow and Leningrad, the Soviet Union was going through an openness that nobody could have foreseen in the dark depths of Stalinist isolation and xenophobia. And Gorbachev witnessed it all at the very heart. He studied at Moscow State University, MGU, with foreign students who were welcomed for the first time. He heard lectures from visiting political figures, as well as academics, historians, and others. It was an atmosphere that I despair at trying to convey to you the springtime after this long, long freeze. Maybe that's hard, again, with reference to the local weather, to appreciate that Gorbachev and others like him went through. It was mind-opening, mind-expanding in ways that are really hard to replicate. And he went back. After graduating, he went back, joined the Communist Party. He was already a youth member of the party, and began a career. That's where all ambitious people made their careers. Even if you were to rise to the tops in industry or academia, you still needed to be a party member. And he first worked back in his native farming region of Stavropol on youth issues, and later on farming and agricultural problems. And we see from letters and testimonies all the way back in the late 1950s and early 60s that he was utterly unusual among provincial party officials. He was willing not only to repeatedly criticize in meetings the problems of current Soviet policies, but to begin proposing remedies, exposing corruption, criticizing the stultifying bureaucracy in ways that others were not, in ways that skirted very close to the kind of behavior that could have got him reprimanded or expelled. Always pushing the envelope was he, and always in a reformist direction. He had met at university and married and brought back to the provinces with him Raisa Maximovna. She was from Siberia. She was also a medalist from her high school, and she went on to graduate studies in sociology, and she was an absolutely unusual figure as well. Because at that time, there was no sociology in the Soviet Union. Because under Lenin and Stalin, sociology had been banned as a Western bourgeois pseudoscience. Why? Well, what does sociology exist for but to study social problems? And we, under scientific socialism in the USSR, have solved all social problems. To admit that any exist is to criticize the regime. And so back in the 1920s, it had actually been banned. But now, into the thaw epoch, as universities gained greater freedoms and scholars yearned for data, for information, to at least understand the scope of what was underway, ambitious graduate students would propose research projects and be permitted to carry them out that amounted to real sociological research. In her case, Raisa Maximovna went out. She was limited, of course, in her choices because she followed her husband to this provincial backwater. She went out into these villages, put on a pair of rubber boots up to the knee because she was slogging through mud much of the year, and went door to door in these dilapidated peasant farmer huts and began interviewing people. She didn't know what at first, until she figured out the kinds of social ills, what kinds of problems concerned people, and eventually was doing large-scale surveys that got her in trouble as well, because among other things, she discovered that the families of brides were still paying dowries, and there were still arranged marriages, as there had been 150 years before. And of course, the level of poverty and neglect in the Russian countryside was unknown to most urban dwellers who'd been fed the propaganda that everyone was happy and healthy. So again, her work was seditious in a way, and was fully in line with the kind of semi-heretical, envelope-pushing approach to political reality of her husband. They made a fantastic team. And in her travels back and forth to Moscow to defend her dissertation, because she was doing it at Moscow State, and to further advance her studies, she came into contact with what we've sometimes called semi-dissident scholars. This would include economists, writers, cultural figures, philosophers of all sorts. In many cases, they'd been fired from university jobs for too openly criticizing or saying heretical things in their lectures that were actually praising America and the West and criticizing the USSR. They weren't quite in the gulag or jailed. But these were people that skirted the margins because of their originality and honesty. And Raisa liked hanging around with them. She just made contacts with these circles and introduced them to her husband. Roughly the same time, I don't need to repeat in that kind of detail, Gorbachev, both separately and with his wife, has the advantage of considerable foreign travel, considerable travel in Western Europe, to Belgium and France on party business, in other cases to Italy and other parts of Central Europe, Austria, on purely private, unsupervised travel. It's enormously mind-opening for someone who's been isolated all this time. Just one vignette to give you an example of that. In 1969, Gorbachev went on a delegation to Czechoslovakia. This was just a few months after the Soviet Union had crushed the Prague Spring. And like others, Gorbachev had only access to the official party line about the necessity of suppressing counter-revolution, that the Czech people were with us, and so forth. And then there were touring factories, the Soviet delegation Gorbachev was heading. And the workers staged a kind of silent, angry protest. And as the Soviet delegation approached, they all turned their backs on them and refused even their greetings and the gifts, the party-to-party, comrade-to-comrade gifts they were bearing. This made an enormous impression on Gorbachev and caused him to rethink yet another linchpin of Soviet foreign policy, and to talk to more people and to learn the true story that so many others didn't know or didn't care to learn. While this is all going on, the second stream, the second important part of the ideas and leadership end to the Cold War is underway as well. An entire generation of new experts in foreign policy is coming up through the system. Because after Stalin died, the thaw didn't just mean poets and artists and honesty about the purges, the so-called camp genre literature. It meant that where there had been nothing before, now the Academy of Sciences opened dozens of new institutes to study Latin America, to study Asia, to study the Middle East, to study the United States and Canada, to study the world economy, one after the other. It may sound unbelievable, but under Stalin, these had not existed. Why would you need to study international relations? It's all there in Lenin's imperialism. The imperialists are out to get us. We have to be vigilant and ready to fight. And there was really no more sophisticated analysis than that. Every country, every capitalist state especially, could be reduced to this caricature of greedy Wall Street bankers and moneylenders at the top and the proletariat suffering below. Now, a young generation of experts were studying for real. As I say, scientists, economists, philosophers, you name it. And they begin rising through the system. And I've mentioned their new research institutes, but it's important to know they also had access to foreign literature and publications, to travel to conferences, and they greeted foreign colleagues at home as well. And more, thanks to a few open-minded party leaders in the academic sphere, they found refuge, they found safe havens, certain institutes or editorial boards where, because it was private, they could say, criticize, propose just about anything. And this is a breeding ground of liberal ideas. This is, in a sense, a preparatory school for perestroika and new thinking that would only come 15, 20 years later when somebody at the top was ready for it. But it's developing all along the way. And when Gorbachev, after his long exile in the provinces, had proved so adept a leader, even though he skirted the boundaries, as I say, of heresy, he was so efficient at management. He met his quotas. He kept corruption to a minimum. His province was simply very well run. The harvest was successful. That he won favor and was brought back to Moscow as Central Committee Secretary for Agriculture. And later he was promoted to the Politburo. CC and PB are the abbreviations for those institutions. And when he got there, Gorbachev did something absolutely unusual. He continued what he and Raisa had been doing on a low level in the provinces. Their own private discussion circles and seminars, their own outreach to innovative or critically thinking writers and economists and, yes, sociologists, now on the national scale. And these became famous. Gorbachev's seminars, he wouldn't hold them in his Moscow apartment, but at weekends on the party-supplied government dacha, country house, that he and Raisa shared. They would invite, again, you see the list of all kinds of specialists, to talk about what's wrong and what might be done. At the beginning, it's the economy and farming, Achilles heels of the Soviet system. But this quickly leads, when they think about automation and efficiency, to experts on computerization and high technology. What is the state of our computer industry? Why? Why does it need to be open to the West in order to thrive? Oh, that's why. And that led quickly, these experts in technology, to people experienced in space travel, exploration of the cosmos, nuclear issues, interested Gorbachev greatly. And that led very quickly to issues of arms control and disarmament, and an absolutely different view of the Star Wars program. Right? Now we're in the early 80s, that Ronald Reagan had announced, whereas the Soviet military-industrial apparatus went into apoplexy over the threat of Star Wars. Gorbachev, at the same time, as a rising leader prepping for the top spot, is hearing about ways that we don't have to respond with more arms racing. We can secure our defenses with modest investments, let the Americans bankrupt themselves. Nuclear war is foolish. Nuclear buildups have long gone past the point of overkill. Gorbachev is hearing things from these semi-dissident or new thinking specialists that nobody else in top party councils is hearing, because he sought them out. And there's much more I could cite. The kinds of books he's reading, his own continuing foreign travel and contacts. Again, this is unprecedented, even heretical for a top communist leader. Nobody before had ever done that. And in fact, it got to the point where it very nearly derailed his rise to the top, because party conservatives began noticing nothing could be completely private in the Soviet Union, and wondering why he was hanging around with these sort of disgraced or out of repute academics, policy analysts. It indeed delayed his rise and complicated his alliances as he moved to the top. But again, so young, so dynamic, and so much, in every respect, more outstanding than the gerontocratic 80-year-olds who were literally dying on their feet, Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, that Gorbachev was the obvious choice simply because of his competence and because he kept some of his radical ideas private. He never said anything that bucked the party line, maybe sometimes a little more liberal, but nothing that directly contradicted it in public, in print, while he was preparing to reach the top. And he reached the top in March of 1985. And again, I've already described some of this in my introduction, so that's not really necessary to repeat. On the domestic front, he starts slowly. The slogan is acceleration, make the existing system work better, reduce absenteeism, raise people's morale, reduce drinking. This doesn't work. In fact, some of it backfires spectacularly, especially the anti-alcohol campaign. Prohibition didn't work there any better than it worked here. But when it came to attempts to free up the economic system, reduce the power of the central plan and the ministries, and allow economic managers, farmers, factory foremen more say, the party blocked with red tape, with passive or even direct resistance, his early attempts at every turn. And this is why he would grow more and more radical and introduce glasnost to air these problems publicly, because through party channels, he found himself in a tiny liberal minority. Foreign policy is different. The leader has much more say. There's a very small bureaucracy, the foreign ministry, that implements it. It's not subject to bureaucratic opposition at every level of the country. Hence, again, within a couple of years, we see the kinds of breakthroughs I've described and which are mentioned here, including, most notably, ending the war in Afghanistan. That was already underway in '87. Just took another year and a half for the last troops to exit. It's hard to get out of a war as we know, and annulling the Brezhnev Doctrine, the right and intention to intervene where the country saw fit to support communism. What I want to emphasize here is these two streams I've described, the innovative, open-minded, and bold leadership of Gorbachev, and this whole cadre, this whole generation, dozens and dozens of liberal reformist foreign and international experts come together and feed off each other. Those advisors gave Gorbachev ideas, suggestions. They urged him on and pushed him when he encountered resistance to go even bolder on this proposal, to break the deadlock, to meet Reagan's bluff and raise him one more. But Gorbachev himself sometimes was in the driver's seat and surprised his advisors with his own boldness when they would have been more cautious. You might know the story of the 1986 summit meeting in Reykjavik, Iceland, where Gorbachev essentially offers total strategic nuclear disarmament, something he had not cleared with the military and nuclear bureaucracy, but seemed like he could reach an agreement with Reagan at that moment, and they almost did. That was Gorbachev's solo. Another time, remember in 1987, when a West German pilot, a private plane, somehow crossed the frontier and flew all the way to Red Square and created a scandal by landing on Red Square. Gorbachev seized that moment to sack the entire top echelon of the Ministry of Defense because they'd been blocking and interfering as much as they could with his plans, and replace them with his people. Again, a bold act to take advantage of the moment in the interests of accelerating progress on foreign affairs. The point I want to leave you with on this slide is that we see again and again that there's something deeply principled, which was so hard for outside analysts of the Soviet Union to accept. It explains part of their skepticism because it seemed impossible that anyone could come up through that system, that foul, oppressive, perverted communist system, and have principles. But Gorbachev did, and they were tested, for example, in the case when the truth of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, or the so-called Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. In 1939, those two signed a pact that essentially unleashed the Second World War, dividing up secretly Poland and other Central European countries. That had been denied in the Soviet Union for decades. And even Gorbachev didn't know the truth of it. But he said, we need historical commissions. The foreigners keep asking us about this. Is it true what we've been taught? And he sent people to open up the once closed archives. And they came back and said, yes, Mikhail Sergeyevich, it's true. This is exactly true what the foreigners say. Then Gorbachev said, then we have to admit it publicly and we have to apologize. And they said, wait a minute. This could be destabilizing because look at the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They're especially touchy on this issue because it was because of that pact that they lost their independence and were incorporated in the USSR. So if we admit the truth of the pact and we publicly apologize if we even raise the issue, we're giving fuel to those Baltic nationalists. So what, said Gorbachev. If it's the truth, we must admit it. The same at the end when it came to the reunification of Germany. Gorbachev and the Soviets were very concerned that if East and West Germany reunited, the country could once again be a threat. Memories of the Second World War and 26 million dead were still fresh for many survivors and their families. There's a special paranoia about Germany. And so when East Germany, the wall came down, East Germany was holding elections, and the two halves wanted to reunify, Gorbachev, of course, had a veto because there were Soviet occupying forces in East Germany, just as there were French, British, and American. It was a four-power occupation that was still in effect. And Gorbachev had a veto. And he stuck to his guns, concerned about what a reunited Germany would mean, especially because West Germany was a member of the NATO alliance. And if they're unified, what happens to East Germany? Does it go from being our Soviet ally to being our enemy overnight? And it looked like those negotiations were stuck. But Gorbachev, when his more liberal advisors And some of the clever Americans said, look, Mr. President, you talk about self-determination and democracy. Well, then you have to let the East Germans decide themselves. If they want to dump communism and hold elections and join the capitalist system, that's their democratic will. And if they want to join with their West German brethren in the NATO alliance, don't they have that right as well? Through self-determination? And Gorbachev said, you're right. And he relented in the end. So he was principled, even in ways that hurt his country or hurt his cause. Let me say a few words, and I want to move to my concluding slides and leave lots of time for discussion, about the Chernobyl catastrophe. Because in criticizing our scholarship, our academic literature, our policy literature, and the debates and actions that flowed therefrom about how the Cold War ended, this is one of the most glaring problems. To those like me, and a small number of experts who have studied from within, again, the biographies, the real politics of the 70s and 80s and how it unfolded, we know that the April 1986 nuclear disaster in Chernobyl was a key turning point. Hundreds and later thousands, because of injuries and cancers that would appear, died as a result of the Chernobyl accident. Nothing on that scale had been seen before. This was far beyond 3 Mile Island or any other previous nuclear accident. It required a marshaling of resources, of soldiers, of emergency personnel, evacuations, and the like, medical, that was actually as if they were fighting a small war. It completely consumed the party leadership, the Politburo, for about 2 months. Every day, crisis meetings, crisis mobilization. We know that. But beyond that, I want to talk about Chernobyl, Chernobyl's overlooked impact, Chernobyl's impact on Gorbachev's reforms, and especially his foreign policy new thinking. And I've described it, using a term in political psychology, as a cognitive punch. It was something so traumatic that it caused a complete change of thinking, a conceptual breakthrough on the part of Gorbachev and his allies. It did that in the following ways. First, nothing could have made clearer that any talk of nuclear confrontation, nuclear war, was idiotic. If one little reactor accident could cause devastation on this scale, what would a real nuclear weapon do? In fact, as you look out over Europe, there are nuclear and chemical and other industrial installations everywhere. There's no way to fight even a conventional war, even a small one in Europe, without setting off disasters of unbelievable magnitude that might not kill as many people as the result of direct attacks or explosions, but the chemical, radiological, and other legacies would be horrific. Forget it. All the stuff Gorbachev is saying that we've been told about preparation, about matching the Americans, is nonsense. Only with Chernobyl did Gorbachev, and even some of the top military, and especially civilian leadership, did they really get it. But now they did. And that pushed, of course, to a whole new stance of flexibility, of concessions, of urgency on nuclear negotiations. That was one breakthrough as a result of Chernobyl. But a second, I say here the inadmissibility of war, a second had more to do with domestic politics and the entire Soviet system. Because Gorbachev and his advisors, as they dealt with this horrible tragedy, they kept asking, well, how could this happen? The nuclear industry, which was very secretive and didn't even report to the members of the Politburo unless forced to, they were given broad autonomy. They've been promising us it's all safe, it's all efficient, it's up to the highest world standards. Yet we have industrial accidents, we have plane and rail crashes all the time, and now we have this horrible nuclear disaster. What is going on in the management of what is supposed to be the most secret, most important, best run and best funded part of our economy, the military-industrial complex? And when they looked more closely, they saw shoddy workmanship, they saw something that had been rushed and sloppy. Essentially, they saw what they saw everywhere in the economy. And they understood that the centralized, top-down, state-run planning and administrative system was bankrupt. If the best of the best showed all the horrible symptoms and failings of the worst then there was no hope. So this pushes Gorbachev to think more radically about economic reforms and decentralizing and doing away with trust in state managers and planners from the top. Finally, yet a third unacknowledged or insufficiently appreciated aspect of the Chernobyl disaster was that Gorbachev and his top allies felt betrayed. They had been trying by this point for for a year and a half, little over a year, through the Geneva summit, through arms proposals, through personal diplomacy. They had been striving to open channels with Reagan and all their conservative leaders. Remember Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain? Remember Helmut Kohl? All the leading countries were led by skeptical conservatives when Gorbachev came to power. So they were trying hard to establish trust, reopen negotiations, and improve relations for the better. Maybe not quite so ambitious as end the Cold War, but something substantively new. And painstakingly, they'd begun to make progress. Remember, Mrs. Thatcher said, Gorbachev, he's someone we can do business with. Reagan said, I like the man. I don't like his country's policies, but maybe they're moving in the right direction. Slowly, the ice began to melt. Progress was made. And then Chernobyl happens. And Gorbachev, trusting the military-industrial complex, had gone on TV, had assured foreign leaders, nothing wrong, tiny little accident, nothing to worry about. And they said, but our radiation counters in Sweden and Finland show sky-high levels. What's going on? And Gorbachev, until the scope of the disaster was clear and they'd begun an investigation, simply repeated the statistics and the press releases he'd been given. As strange as it sounds, that's how that system operated. And that's the kind of secrecy and autonomy the military-industrial complex had. When the full scope of the disaster, therefore, came out, when Gorbachev realized that he'd been lying to his foreign interlocutors because his own conservatives and military brass had been lying to him, he felt betrayed. And in a perverse way, he felt closer to Reagan, Thatcher, and Kohl than he did to his own generals and ministers. A huge push to break with the old system and the old conservatism. Finally, let me get to my concluding points about why so much of this is misunderstood, how it's ignored in our scholarship, and again, in our policy-making foreign establishment. In other words, the academics and the practitioners in universities and in Washington. Take my word for it, you can read all these works if you'd like, but in most studies of the Cold War's end, Chernobyl is almost ignored. If it is mentioned, in most cases, it's only as something that costs them a lot to clean up. In other words, the power or materialist argument, which says, we spent them into the grave, we bankrupted them with Star Wars and our military programs, and the Stinger missiles and so forth, would add Chernobyl to this list as simply an economic liability that only made things tougher for Gorbachev, and nothing more. They completely ignore this cognitive, conceptual impact that I've described in such detail, and they also ignore how early it happened, in March, April of 1986. Because, consistent with their explanations that say it's all about military and economic pressure, they don't see the treaties signed and the big changes in Soviet policy until a little bit later. And they want, their theories demand, that it coincide with when the Soviet economy began a sharp tumble. And that was only after 1988. So there's this strong tendency to ignore or downplay anything that happened before that date. And in this case, despite overwhelming evidence, it happened a full 2 years earlier. It couldn't be an important part of the story because it doesn't fit our preferred model. As I say, materialist, power-based, in IR theory, we call them realist. Those kind of explanations dominate the end of the Cold War. I've done a little study of IR textbooks, what's taught in the IR 101, the introductory international relations classes. And across the board, the chapters or sections dealing with the Cold War end are very conventional and very focused on the economic or material pressure explanation, and leave leadership and ideas by the wayside. Why are these ideational and leadership factors ignored? And now I'll just issue my indictment rather quickly and move to a conclusion. And we have some terms for these, and here they are. There are different distinct forms of bias in academic research, in political science. There they are. The bias of determinism, we all know what this is, right? When something happens and we look back, there's a tendency, subtle sometimes, but powerful, to feel that, well, that's the way it had to be. The way some series of events transpired was probably heavily preordained. We just have a tendency, looking back, to think, yeah, what happened was most likely to happen. After all, it happened, didn't it? As strange as that sounds, it's pervasive thinking. More precisely, in political science, we talk about the bias of hindsight, and in political psychology. And that simply means, as I say, I knew it all along, this tendency, looking back, to think, yeah, that's what I expected to happen. That's consistent with what I believed. So if you have a particular theory that's materialist or power-based, and something happens, you want it to be consistent. You knew it all along. And what this means, by definition, is that we are ignoring what might else have happened, what we like to call counterfactuals. Were all the turning points indeed heavily weighted in favor of the outcome that happened? Or was it actually a close call? Could it have gone off the rails or gone in a different direction at various points? And if so, we have to look at those various points and see, did Gorbachev matter? Was it the economy? Was it some advisors? Was it some foreign leader? What was determinant at each stage? No, that's very complicated counterfactual thinking. And so, again, the tendency, the bias. And of course, it's an excuse to avoid self-criticism. Because what if what I said is true? What if it all happened backwards, but with the same result? What if Reagan's pressure, Star Wars, ramping up the arms race, in fact made it harder for Gorbachev to do what he wanted all along? There's a strong case to be made for that a more conciliatory American leader would have enabled him to make more progress more quickly, right? The hawks on each side always support each other, and the doves are always pushed aside. So Gorbachev had to fight against more resistance at home because of Star Wars, because of XYZ abroad. And yet he won. That's an entirely different story of the Cold War's end. It means Gorbachev was the main player, not Reagan, and it means we had near misses and obstacles along the way instead of the smooth sailing, predetermined outcome. And if there were near misses, and if our policies complicated things and were counterproductive, then we have to look at ourselves critically and say we might have better done it differently. We made it harder. We made the outcome more, problematic. We have to engage in self-criticism. We don't like that, so we avoid it. Bias of method, defense of dominant theory. Well, this is no surprise. If you have a theory of international relations and something happens that seems to challenge it, the first tendency is not to rethink your theory. After all, you've spent a career writing articles and books saying that this is the way it is. Instead, you look for extraordinary circumstances or exceptions that make what happened consistent with your theory, even though it looks like it might not be. And then we see that all over the political science and international relations professions in explaining the Cold War's end. The same people, remember my early slide that said there was a complete consensus of Sovietologists and international relations specialists that no major reforms were in the offing, are now busy explaining why it was in fact inevitable. It was inevitable all along, but none of us saw it at that time. How could that be? Well, there must have been some evidence we didn't know about. Maybe the economy was worse than we thought. Maybe there was some kind of internal corruption. There had to be something else. But at all costs, I'm going to preserve my theory. Right? Philosophers of science, Karl Popper and others, call this ad hocery. Right? Ad hoc additions to a theory to modify it to explain circumstances when the theory in fact fails. And above all, how do we ask questions about what to study and how we explore a problem? Again, the biases of hindsight, the deterministic thinking, and the tendency to want to defend a theory that I've made public and staked my name on, all lead me to ask, when it's Gorbachev, when it's Obama, when it's Putin, why did he do what he did? Why did he do that? What kind of circumstances, psychological, military, made it likely that Putin took that step, or Gorbachev took that step. Rarely do we ask, what else might he have done? And if he had alternatives, why did he choose the one he did? Notice the former question is biased in favor of a deterministic outcome. That outcome was likely, so let's look for the factors that made Putin likely to do X or Gorbachev likely. It removes the agency of the leader and it puts it on external circumstances because he's acting under material pressures usually that don't give him much room for maneuver. But the second question, what else might he have done? And why did he choose something else instead? Makes us think more about the leader, his own agency, his or her own agency, and their alternatives. Very subtle difference, but with enormous ramifications. Finally, there are very obvious, straightforward human failings. We like to think, we Americans, if we're American, British, whatever it might be, that we should get credit for something good. So even without meaning to, we tend to credit the American side, and if not discredit, then at least ignore the other party to this bilateral relationship. And so, again, political psychologists call this attribution, a bias of attribution or attribution theory. And it's well documented in experimental as well as broad observational studies. That is, when you and I have something that we're fighting or contending over, and you do something I don't like, the bias is, dang it, she's always doing that. That's just because she's that way. She's just disagreeable or unreliable. I attribute it to her negative nature. When I do something distasteful, maybe I fund the Sandinistas or I have a scandal in my government. Oh, that's not me. There was some situation that constrained me or some accident happened. But I'm a good person, so that was an exception. So the same act that I attribute to her negative nature, I tend, when I commit the same act, to dismiss or explain through unavoidable circumstances. That's well documented. Well, it also infects the literature on the Cold War's end. So when Gorbachev does something good, he had no choice. We can't say he's good. There was just no alternative. When our side, Reagan or whomever, does something good, we are good. We get credit. Finally, there's simply way more English language sources for scholars. You have to know Russian and have to put up with very difficult circumstances to interview people, get access to memoirs, and what's published is smaller and it's in the Russian language, very little translated. Whereas every American who had any part in a negotiation or government, as you know, produces articles and memoirs left and right. So for the ordinary international relations scholar, there's simply a 10, if not 20 to 1 preponderance of evidence on one side. Why does any of this matter? Well, this is self-evident. I probably don't even have to dwell on what's written here. We want, as scholars, to get it right, simply to get it right for historical accuracy. But more importantly, I quote myself, one-sided lessons and triumphal attitudes lead to future policy mistakes. Right? And here, indictment or case number 1 is obvious. Confident that power and pressure and the efficacy of material or military force, was proven in the way the Cold War ended. Whereas ideas, leadership, individuals and culture, what have you, are pushed aside. Then it makes it much easier to blunder off into Iraq thinking, again, depose the leader, put some new institutions in place, it'll pay for itself and it'll all go swimmingly. They will greet us as liberators and so forth. Well, this isn't just an analogy or intuitive. The exact same, largely neoconservatives, we're talking about Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, Douglas Feith, and others, who were prominent in the Reagan administration upper military defense bureaucracy and saw the Cold War ending one way. Obviously, a guy in the Defense Department says it was the military that did it. And a guy in the State Department says it was diplomacy that did it. Well, these guys in the military concluded one set of lessons, the ones I'm indicting today, about how the Cold War ended, and proceeded to act in the post-Cold world with probably exaggerated confidence and in one tool in their toolkit, and insufficient regard for others. But it's not only neoconservatives. It's also liberals, those who believe in democracy promotion, that, again, regime change, that you can rapidly change a society, not by military force, but by selective targeting of pressure, of money, of training in democracy, that you can quickly turn a former communist or autocratic country into a liberal one on the Western model. Those experiments, too, have failed. It's important to note that these liberal interventionists and democracy promoters, with their exaggerated faith in how rapidly you can transform a foreign society coming out of decades of totalitarian oppression, have been just as prominent in post-Cold War Bush and Obama foreign policy as the neoconservatives have with the military weapon. I'm arguing that both, although there are many other reasons for failure, an important part goes back to the way we drew the wrong, narrow, and one-sided lessons about how the Cold War ended. I'll stop there. We have plenty of time for questions. Thank you. Yes. Yeah, I'll call on hands as I see them. Yes, sir.
You mentioned philosophers among the post-Stalin intellectuals. In the Western world, in recent decades, it hasn't always been very obvious that philosophers are influential. Do you have a sense of how important intellectually philosophers were for the end of the Cold War and the Russian response to the end of the Cold War?
They were extremely important in a general way, but not in the particulars of policymaking. And you're absolutely right. Your intuition there is that in Russia, in the Soviet Union, poets, philosophers, and other cultural figures probably have greater impact on people's thinking and development than maybe in this country. And especially so in the Soviet Union, coming out of the Stalinist period, there was a rebirth of philosophy. And some of it was simply discovering what they'd missed out on for 50, 60 years in the West. So you have Russians reading Jean-Paul Sartre, right, the French existentialist. You have a collection of, I'm going to mess up the names, I won't even try, 3 or 4 old Russian guys, pre-revolutionary philosophers, who had actually somehow survived the whole Lenin-Stalin period, greeted as heroes when they came back to lecture at Moscow State University. You had the Georgian philosopher Merab Mamardashvili, who, along with some others, was able to take advantage of the openness I described and go to Prague and Italy and work on these editorial boards of these joint Soviet foreign publications. He was a Cartesian philosopher, and again, it's not so much the content of what Sartre had taught or what Mamardashvili himself was developing. It was that this came with an opening to the Western world. And interest in Western philosophy went along with interest in music and art and culture. They'd never seen the paintings of Picasso, those bourgeois liberal defamations, right? They had never read the works of Sigmund Freud, right? And again, you might not go into a Freudian direction. You might not be a, aficionado, abstract or cubist expression. But it was an important part of rediscovering the West of Europe, which had so long been Russia's vocation. And intellectuals felt cut off. So philosophers, partly in the spirit of humanism, right? Marxist, Leninist philosophy is garbage. Russian thinking has to be part of the world. Yes, that broadly supports liberal, universal human values. But maybe equally important was it was just part of the experience of reforming and opening up to the West. It was very important. And also, I spent a lot of time interviewing philosophers, so either I wasted my time and my investment, or they had something important to say. I think it's the latter. Yes, sir.
Gorbachev's economic changes led to the bankruptcy of Russia and the rise of a cadre of billionaires. What changes was he attempting to make that failed that led to this? If that's not too big a question.
Phase one of Gorbachev didn't appreciate that the system simply couldn't be made to work more efficiently. That if he exhorted people to be more honest, that if he made it harder for them to drink, that if he applied both carrots and sticks, the sticks would be if you show up late to work or you cheat, you're going to get fired. The carrots, of course, would be greater incentives. All within the existing system, that wouldn't work. He tried that for a couple of years. It never really had a chance because party bureaucrats and economic managers were blocking any changes, but they were still very timid. Stage 2 of Gorbachev tries to become much more radical and makes a different mistake, which is insufficient appreciation now that he can't have it both ways, that he cannot graft a new private sector onto the state-run part of the economy, because that's what he tried to do. Preserve the economy, because after all, there are 300 million people living on it with jobs, with production. And how do you just get rid of it overnight? So he left that in place, but he started passing laws that permitted cooperatives, private ownership, free enterprise, that limited the power of party managers, that reduced the influence of the central plan. And what happened was it all backfired. It only made it worse. I'll give you an example. Great idea, something called the Law on State Enterprises. This was a law that said, you know what, factory managers have been shackled by idiotic instructions, bureaucracy, and delay from above, from Moscow, from the central plan. Let's reduce that and give them more autonomy to make production decisions, to buy supplies, to set prices. Let's let factory managers who know the enterprise run the enterprise with less interference. Good idea, right? Second great idea, also in 1988, law on cooperatives. It's not enough to make state factories run more efficiently. We know from the West that private enterprise is the most efficient of all. We have to reintroduce private ownership of property, private business. And so they do it through something called cooperatives. They couldn't quite call it private enterprise. That sounded too Wall Street Journal-y. That was just too much for conservatives to accept. But Lenin himself had spoken about cooperatives. So they do it under that fig leaf. A cooperative is where you and I'm getting along with her now, even though she's problematic because of her nature. I'm a good guy. So the 3 or 4 of us decide to form a cooperative. It's a private business, only there's a legal fiction that none of us is an owner and an employee. We're all cooperatively sharing. But that's how the new private businesses were introduced. Remember, law on state enterprises, 1988 gives managers a lot of leeway and unshackles them. Cooperatives introduces free enterprise. Nobody thought through what would happen when those two came together. And this is what happened. These state managers, they called them red directors. Red because they were still appointed by the Communist Party, but now they have all this leeway. These red directors said, it's pretty cool that I have all this autonomy to make purchase decisions now, but my friend Ivan has formed a cooperative. I'm going to join with him and become simultaneously a private businessman. So now I'm a registered member of this cooperative and I'm still running this state organization. What do I do next? As the owner of a state, let's say I work in retail. I have shoes, footwear, clothing, always in shortage. Here's what I'm going to do. I'll use my new authority to sell 500 pairs of shoes to the cooperative for 3 rubles. There's no more oversight. I can do that. I have autonomy to make production decisions. So I basically strip my state factory, but now I have this incredible production that I own, or the 3 of us own. Nobody, as strange as it sounds, had thought through that that was a possibility. And so there's wholesale theft of state enterprises, not just under Yeltsin in the 90s, but it began under Gorbachev in the late 80s. I could give you a dozen more examples of how dysfunctional the attempt was to build a private sector while the state sector was still in place. It was constantly siphoning off resources, whether in outright criminal ways or ones that were quasi-legal. Winston Churchill apparently said this to Nikita Khrushchev, the guy who began de-Stalinization in the thaw in the mid-50s, and he saw what Khrushchev was trying to do. He tried some reforms as well. They were also half-hearted. And he apparently said to him, look, you can't jump across an abyss in 2 leaps. It's either all or nothing. And I guess the British Sovietologists and economics, the British led the study of this centrally planned economies. We all studied Alec Nova and other British luminaries in their works of the 60s and 70s. And they basically informed Churchill, who said it's not going to work. Half measures. But to go all the way, look how impossibly difficult that was. So Yeltsin comes in 92, the USSR collapses, he's running Russia, and he tries shock therapy, overnight privatization. And that was a decade-long disaster. Russia was only recovering from. It's devilishly hard. Gorbachev couldn't do it, and arguably Yeltsin didn't do so well either. Russians have been suffering over this for 20 years. Yes, sir. Back there. Yeah.
What is back in 86 and 87 change the picture of resurgent nationalism, which is the picture that we have, from 89 forward? I mean, does that mean that we get the beginnings of German unification, the beginnings of sort of the Czech nationalist movement in 86, or how does this change the sort of, ideas?
I'm not sure that the conventional explanation of how nationalism and separatism arose is that far off the mark, that I would challenge that. The conventional story being Gorbachev didn't anticipate this. Being a kind of narrow-minded Russian who'd lived most of his life in Russian areas, he didn't appreciate that there were Ukrainian feelings that were resentful for decades of oppression and killings, that the Armenians or Georgians yearned for independence. Maybe not the entire society, people were just getting by, but certainly intellectuals and elites, that there was this latent nationalism. And that when he did two things, he would set it loose. Number one, he gave it voice through the political process and glasnost, and then he gave it an issue with his failing economy. Because everywhere in these republics, you see an initial surge of patriotism and nationalism, but it's not yet separatism. Strange as it sounds, the first big separatist movement, Sąjūdis in Lithuania, was a pro-perestroika movement. Because Gorbachev was giving them everything, the truth, openness, promising them autonomy and more freedoms. But when the economy went into the tank and people are hungry, then it becomes more radical. Then those nationalist leaders can very credibly say to their people, it's not enough to get your language back, your culture, apologies from Moscow. If their economy stinks, if we break away and join the West, we join the European Union, we'll get all this aid, we'll prosper. Staying with the Soviet Union is staying with a sinking ship. So, yeah, that story is accurate. And some of it applies to Eastern Europe as well. Give them political freedoms and a voice, but then give them economic circumstances so dire that they decide to go it alone. And there were always separatists and nationalists, but they attract a mass following only after, again, 87, 88, when the economy got so bad. Yeah.
You kind of paint a picture of Gorbachev being the guy who tried all these great things but just couldn't really succeed. And I don't believe that view. I believe Gorbachev was self-serving and not this great guy you kind of paint him out to be. It seems like Chernobyl was one of those mistakes where you kind of said, oh, you just didn't know, but I don't think that's the case. I think he wanted it covered up. I think he did it on purpose and played dumb. This Gorbachev that you talk about just doesn't equate to the Gorbachev that I think that is in history. Being he had these intentions of changing things and just kind of failed along the way, it doesn't compute in my mind. The road to hell was paved with good intentions. And I think he kind of paved that way as well. I don't believe him to be such a great guy that you paint him out to be.
I don't know what to say in response, because it seems like you're saying two different things. One is crediting his good intentions, but they still led to hell because they were good intentions with bad execution. And with that, I agree completely. But the other part of your remarks seem to deny him good intentions. And that's where, just based on my own research and that of colleagues, I have to respectfully disagree. I don't know, any study of the Soviet Union but especially further back under Stalin, things were more secretive. There's very little paper record. Under Gorbachev, there's much more in the way of archives, Politburo transcripts, meeting notes, and so forth, that give a lot of support to what I'm saying. But I admit that, again, a lot of it has to do with getting inside Gorbachev's mind. And I can't claim to, ultimately, definitively be able to say he thought this was his intention. Just my best reading of the record says that he deserves more credit than he usually gets.
Well, I'm thinking about your materialistic explanation and your, I guess I'll call it psyche-shaking explanation, and I realize that they're not mutually exclusive, but what strikes me is that the materialistic explanation is reflected in changes in structure. That is, that the changes in the former Soviet economy before and after the collapse are reflective of materialistic explanations. And when we think about the psyche-shaking explanation, we also then need to remember that in contrast to the materialistic changes in the structures, memories are short. And that is that the psyche-shaking event of Chernobyl is now 30 years in the past. And the people whose psyches were shaken are no longer in the positions of leadership. And so how does that affect sort of the course of events?
Well, it affects the course of scholarship. But let's just take one part of that. The use of interviews and the personal experiences gained through whether the writings or personal conversations as a scholar with the witness or participant as part of scholarly record, as evidence in support of one or another interpretation. It's devilishly difficult because people are self-serving, and I kind of touch on that because, of course, there is memoir and biography support for the materialist explanation, too. That was part of one of my final points. But people are self-serving, so the scholar has to do their level best to talk to as many people, compare accounts, compare it to the factual record, if there are events, things that are quantifiable, things that were parts of decisions that were written down, and reach a judgment, whether Ivan Ivanovich or Svetlana, Maximovna tends to be honest and reliable, or if we see contradictions where they discredit themselves. So that's just basic. Secondly, maybe too close to the event, depending on the nature of the event, things are raw. People are still tied to individuals or bureaucracy or organizations with a stake in a particular interpretation. So sort of the immediate scene can be not conducive to the best record. But again, too much later, and things have changed so much, memories fail, and so forth, that can also be negative. So maybe there's a sweet spot in the middle. But it really depends on the person and event at issue. I'm not sure there's any golden rule about that. But let me give you an example on the other side of the seeming objectivity of material evidence versus oral psycho-historical interpretation. Because this is a point of dispute I've had with some in the journals and the arguments. In 1986, the year 1986 begins, and Gorbachev is frustrated. Things are starting to unfreeze. He's had the Geneva summit. There's another summit planned that would eventually be the Reykjavik summit, but he hasn't managed to get through to induce any Western, for all of his offered concessions. Reagan is still standing firm. He's obsessed about Star Wars, et cetera, et cetera. That's the situation. Without going into enormous detail, Gorbachev has a set of meetings with Mrs. Thatcher, some other Western leaders, and he's back at the Politburo. This is after Chernobyl, of course. He's back at the Politburo presenting the proposals he's going to take to Reykjavik, to the summit, which are very bold indeed. People of the materialist orientation have pointed to a transcript of a Politburo meeting where he was explaining and defending his proposals. which amounted to deep cuts and concessions. And he said in that meeting, comrades, what are we going to do otherwise? We don't have the resources to keep up this arms race. He said that. Wow, that should be conclusive. English, you're wrong. We have a Politburo transcript where he says in front of the top leadership body, we have to make these concessions because we're broke. But if you stop there, you've stopped there. What other evidence shows is that, again, all that I described about Chernobyl had just occurred. Furthermore, that he had been talking to his chief, Edward Shevardnadze, his foreign minister and one of his confidant and a few other close advisors. And there's a paper record of this too. He went to the foreign ministry and gave a talk. And it's an absolutely different Gorbachev. He's saying something very different. He says, you know what, everything's screwed up in the world. He says, the Americans run around in Latin America like it's their, like it's their fiefdom. But you know what, we're doing the same thing in Eastern Europe, and I'm sick of it. Those conservative leaders, we don't control them, they control us. They screw up, they yank our chain, and we go in and have to pay for a huge invasion. The world hates us. He says, think about it the other way around. We're no better than the Americans, and we're being made fools of by these supposed communist fraternal allies. I'm sick of it. This has to change. And he goes through this whole indictment with, again, the top echelons of the foreign ministry. There's no money involved. There's no, we have to do this because we're broke. And there's all this passion and excitement that shows something genuine. It's not a scripted speech. So there you go. For the same set of decisions that were major concessions, for which there exists Politburo transcript evidence that money and the shortage of money was the main thing, there's also, if you dig deeper, a very different kind of evidence. And I have a partial answer for it. Some of it goes to your question. Gorbachev was, I won't say schizophrenic, but he was learning along the way. He would do something liberal and inspired, and then he would go back to his conservative roots. That's a slightly more complicated picture than I've given you, but it's a little closer to reality. He's progressing, but there's backsliding. And he goes back to familiar nostrums and the comfort of the party apparatus sometimes. Because being out there on the extreme and constantly exposed to criticism is really uncomfortable. That's one thing that helps explain. The second is, when you look at other Politburo transcripts and compare them to what we know, you realize that Gorbachev had a special way of speaking to the conservatives. He couldn't go to Yegor Ligachev or Sokolov, the defense minister, or any of these other troglodytes. Dmitry Ustinov was Minister of Armaments under Stalin, for God's sake. These people were deeply Stalinist. Do you think he's going to go up to them and say, you know what, philosophy, that's it, existentialism, universal human values? He had to sell a program, and he spoke to them in the only language that would work. We have no choice, comrades. But when he spoke to a different group, it appears, it's still my judgment, but it's consistent with so much other evidence, it appears that there's a man of ideas and innovation there, yes, who goes back and forth inconsistently. It's harder than you can imagine to find some truth in that. But that's what we're struggling with.
Thank you.
Are we out of time? Thank you. Thank you very much.